Simplest today, Tassus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the legal sentencing and guilty verdicts and people being sent to prison in Britain over the recent disturbances over those 3 or 4, whatever it was, white primary school age children, I think they were a dance class or something like that, that were killed in England by a black man. I think he was a first generation immigrant, or children of a first generation immigrant, I think it was. Now the media and the globalist cabal has focused exclusively on the disturbances that came afterwards, and they've effectively vanished from the public discourse the fact that those children were killed by this guy. It's like it never happened. Somehow all these right-wing Nazi swastika-waving thugs just appeared out of the ground and started. I mean, talk about propaganda. But what I want to concentrate on here is the court cases. Now, there's one of the recent cases that's raised eyebrows, and is a woman, I think she's about 40 years old, and white woman, and she made an indiscreet and ill-advised social media post, in my view at least, and the full force of the law with all no expense spared, vigor on steroids. They were these righteous people are going to root out those Nazis and their swastika waving. So this is quite an ordinary woman. I think she'd worked or was working in some sort of childcare place. So anyway, she gets arrested and dragged off for the hate crime, the normal sort of vague and undefinable hate crime type thing. Gets dragged off for that. And what was surprising, certainly to me anyway, was when I saw she got a sentence of, I think, 2.5 years in prison. Now, I don't know what that's going to work out to good behavior and this, that, and the next thing. But nonetheless, 2.5 years is a headline number. That seems astonishing for a tweet. She wasn't even there at the riots and the disturbances and the protests. She had nothing to do with it. So that sort of sentence for putting up a mean tweet was actually, I don't know if it was a tweet. I think it might have been on Facebook, but anyway, a social media post, and that seems incredible to me. And when you look at some of the sentences given out to brown people that commit quite severe crimes, and yet they get 6 months or probation or climate change protesters that bring the whole city to a standstill, and they get nothing at all, or they get a 3-month suspended sentence or something ridiculous. But here's somebody being, now this is, this woman's not the only one. There are a number of people, all of them white, interestingly, who are given quite severe sentences, whether they were anywhere near the protests or not, simply for the putting some sort of a mean tweet online. Now, I've looked at some of these tweets, and again, I mean, not something I'd put up, but again, I would describe them as ill-advised and indiscreet, possibly provocative, I guess, if you wanted to go the full distance on it. But criminal? Are you kidding? Give me a break. That's bullshit. They're not fucking criminal, those postings. And also it's the two-tier policing thing is quite selective. There are people can march up and down city streets saying death to the Jews, and the police do nothing. The ringleaders don't get arrested. The organisers don't get arrested. The tweets and the social media posts that they make and the text that they send, absolutely brimming with hate. No one gets arrested there. But if you're a white person complaining about mass migration and multiculturalism, then suddenly the full force of the law will spare no resources in pursuing you, no expenses spared. The vigor and the energy they put into it clearly shows that they have a couple of hot buttons and breaking the law and beating people up or murdering them or threatening, it's white people who don't like mass migration. That seems to be where the action is. But what I wanted to have a look here in particular was the way that the cases are structured. I'll use that term. Now, you have to have in order to make this happen, you have to have activist police, globalist controlled activist police. You had to have globalist controlled activist prosecutors, and you had to have globalist controlled activist judges, and you had to have a globalist controlled activist, or at least intimidated and held in thrall, a globalist controlled legal profession. So now without those things, you couldn't get this into court, a case like this into court. There would be, the measures that would be taken would be something like, well, put it on put more privacy settings on your account, or these sorts of things. And the idea of going from the mean tweet straight into prison is unthinkable, and it's insane, and it's a sign of insanity in my view. So, or certainly the corruption and perversion of the legal system by the globalists. And I'll come back to that in a minute, because it's any imposed power structure must corrupt the law. It cannot do otherwise. It is a mandatory requirement of an imposed political control, social control power structure, that it must and can do nothing else other than corrupt the law. And we'll talk about a bit about that in a minute. But here's the interesting things about these cases that I've noticed, and again, assuming I've understood it correctly, is that the court relies almost exclusively on assumptions regarding intent. So have you, for example, somebody makes a mean tweet. Did that encourage anybody to engage in, unlawful behavior? Did it incite anyone to engage in any form of unlawful behavior? Did it cause any harm to anybody? Did it cause any law breaking? Was it so that would be, you'd think, a basic standard. You put out a tweet saying, or a social media post saying, I don't like mass migration, or something like that. For example, does this mean that incited anyone to anything? I mean, did it influence anyone's opinion or view? Well, that's possible. But how can you measure that, as in facts and evidence and so on? So the court relies heavily on, you intended to do that. You wanted that to create mayhem and so on. It was your intention. Was it? And where is your evidence for that? Well, the court has no evidence. There is no evidence for that. They simply are asserting it. Now, this is where ideological law comes in. They just assert, in this case, the court just asserts that your intention was to do so and so. And, the next tier in this is that these people have lawyers that are, again, controlled by the globalists. And there's backroom discussions and backroom things going on that if you don't encourage this person to plead guilty, you'll never work in this town again, Mr. Lawyer. So you better do what we want, or else that's it. Your law career is over, and you're 40 years old. What else are you going to do? Really, you'll be washed up, finished, and so on. So it's not hard to get to these people, or the alternative can be the case. We want you to get this person to plead guilty. That's your mission in this case. This will be an informal, whispered conversation in the corridors or the halls of the courtrooms and so on. We want you to get this person to plead guilty. And by the way, did you know that there's an opening for a legal advisor for such and such a government quango, or an NGO or something, we're in bed with, and pays very well with lots of study trips to Tahiti. So it's an opening. We'd like to recommend you for it, Billy Bob. But just make sure that client of yours pleads guilty to this thing, and who knows? I'm sure we can I'm sure I can arrange a meeting for you with these people. They can do it that way. So it doesn't matter either way. You'll never work in this town again, or they'll dangle some juicy carrot. And all they've got to do is sell out just one client, just one person. They've just got to act illegally and not represent their clients while taking their clients' money, by the way. And that's all they got to do. Who cares? Hey, it's only one Nazi. Only one Nazi is being put on the funeral pyre. What's wrong with that? Hey. And this is the mentality you see amongst these people. So the mere fact you're against mass migration or query it, question it even, that means you are a Nazi. That means you're a bad person. You morally have no right to even exist. So if you're found guilty and thrown in prison, well, that's kind of the right thing for people who don't think the right way. I mean, gee whiz, So again, it's ideology. So they can impute or assert intent, and even though they've got no evidence you did something illegal, or they've got no evidence you incited anyone to do anything or break any law. They've got no evidence, nothing. They've got nothing, absolutely nothing. They've got the tweet or the social media posting, and then the rest of it, they just assume that was your intent. Your intent was to do such and such, and they can make that up. That they can, because they don't need evidence either way. They can just invent. Your intent was to incite a riot and hatred, hate. It was to spread hate, and how many swastikas do you have at home? And that type of approach. And so, how can you defend against that? Because you can't prove something didn't happen that didn't happen. You can't prove something doesn't exist that didn't exist. So your situation is impossible if you have an activist court that does this. Well, that was your intention. Now, and it's an outrageous form of legal practice, jurisprudence, and yet the globalist controlled governments all over the Western world practice this with increasing impunity, and the judges and the structures and the people and the oversights that would prevent against this or limit its reach are all disappearing fast. So ideological law will be the only law that exists very soon, should the current trends continue. So now I've been involved in a number of court cases where ideology there was no ideology in it. It was the facts. It was the evidence. That was it. And you couldn't argue something in the court unless you could produce the evidence. That's how the law works, or used to work. So even if you would notice during the conduct of the court case, even if you would notice and think, wow, this is evidence, or this is an issue here, you couldn't even raise it in the court unless you could back it up with evidence. You had to have the evidence. You could make the assertions, but only evidence mattered, and the judge would just dismiss it. No, so Billy Bob, do you have evidence? Evidence, facts to back up what you're claiming. And if you couldn't produce the evidence, the judge would wave it away. Not even going to look at it or discuss it or consider it. You must have evidence. The evidence must be based on hard facts, and that was it. So there was no imputing intent or anything like that. I suppose to some extent there could be if there was a pattern of facts that supported it, but aside from that, it was a facts only gig. And so I was a witness in one. I had to prepare documents in another few cases, and all the time it was facts. Now, when you have to prepare documents, this is in contract law. If you have to prepare documents and you have to be absolutely rigorous in your presentation of the facts and the evidence, if the senior lawyer goes into court to argue the case and you've screwed up and you don't have all the bits of paper all in sequence, all marked, all corroborated and so on and so forth, properly filed and numbered. If you don't have that, you're in a lot of trouble. Not only will the judge ball you out and throw the case out, but the senior lawyer will give you a mouthful as well, and you'll be known as unreliable and that type of thing. So you had to make sure those documents were all in place. And I look at the cases against these people. That's how it was then. I look at the cases against these people are being put in prison in Britain. Certainly the documents I've been able to look at, and I'm astonished at how sloppy it all is. There's no case against these people at all, I would argue. Everything is inferred, imputed, suggested or implied, or the evidence they have against them is like nothing. You prove that this incited a riot, prove it incited somebody to protest, prove it incited somebody, because the state couldn't do that. So what the state does is they lower the burden of proof on themselves. And so we don't need a burden of proof. We just need to say you meant to do something or say you did something. And the burden of proof is now on you to prove that you didn't do it. Or even worse still, the burden of proof is on you to prove you didn't intend to do it, which is almost an impossible thing. How can you prove that you had or didn't have intent or purpose when they say you did, when the default position is that you're guilty unless you can prove the contrary? So straight away, it's a radical departure from an outrageous departure from the basic standards of jurisprudence, which means you must have evidence and facts. And that the state, it's incumbent on the state to prove your guilt, not on you to prove your innocence. And with all these ideological cases that we're seeing now, the people being locked up for the protests in England, is that they've reversed the burden of proof. The state doesn't need a burden of proof. They just need to see a tweet or a social media post, and that's it. That's all they need. And they can drag you into court on that basis, and purely on the basis that they say you intended to do something bad, and morally it's underwritten by, well, if you're against mass migration, you got to be a fucking Nazi, possibly Hitler thrice. So this is a horrible, grotesque perversion of the legal process. Now, coming to legal systems where a minority is imposing a political system or a governmental control system on the majority, and the majority doesn't want it or never agreed to it. Now, this could be, it's pretty much the case in every communist Marxist government. You could say there's an exception maybe in some of the South American but there was heavy rigging and stacking in those elections, such as the election of Salvador Allende in Chile and that sort of thing, and a couple of other South American. If there's even, there's maybe been one sort of communist government elected to office in South America ever, and one of those dirt poor banana republic places. But otherwise, there's been no. Everywhere where a communist government has come in, it's been imposed at the point of a gun. And again, whether it be the Bolshevik Revolution or Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge or the Communist Chinese Revolution and so on, and some of the African revolutions, they've all been at the point of a gun. So what do they do? Because it's a minority imposing a government on an unwilling majority, they have to use the courts to go after people that disagree, and they call these people, they call these citizens who disagree with them or question it even enemies of the people, counter-revolutionaries, and this sort of thing. And they use these terms to really rid them of any strip them of any legal rights. Same as they do today. Well, you're a Nazi, you're Hitler, like Trump is literally Hitler, so it's okay to kill him because he's literally Hitler. Anyone that disagrees with mass migration, and well, you're literally Hitler, so it's okay to put you in prison. You have no legal rights. It's that type of thing, and you saw this through the divorce courts where they could just arbitrarily and ideologically assert intent. Well, you're a straight white male Christian, so of course you're evil. So your intent must be evil, and they could do that and get away with it because it was an ideological court, not a court of law. Now that structure of law that we saw in the divorce courts, going back decades now, it has permeated all areas of the legal profession at all levels and in all manner. And so, these people don't see themselves as being incumbent. It's not incumbent upon them to produce any facts or evidence. It's just not necessary. All you need to do is say, "We say you're a Nazi." That's it. Prison for you, motherfucker. And so that's how it goes. And that's what we're seeing. I would allege that's what we're seeing in Britain or anywhere where they're looking at and saying, well, a mean tweet is, or a mean social media posting is itself a crime. Now, on the other side of it, and this is how crimes are handled differently. We saw it in the Soviet Union, Communist China, Pol Pot's Cambodia, and so on. A crime against the ideology of the government, the imposed ideology that the people never agreed to, a crime against that is considered very, very serious because it interferes with or could potentially interfere with their power. Whereas if you murder someone or beat them to death or steal their money or break into their house and take everything, if you do that, then that doesn't really matter. That's kind of okay. Well, we'd rather that didn't happen, but that's not the main game. That's not where the serious end of things are. Ideological crime is the serious end of things, and we see this in Britain. So the difference is that when the black or brown person beats someone half to death, they think, well, it's okay, it's not nice. We don't really want that to be going on, but their intention wasn't to oppose our power, our ideological power. That wasn't their intention. They just had a problem with that person, and that was, it's just a personal, local thing, and we discourage that sort of behaviour. But look, it doesn't really matter. We don't want to get excited about this, and so that's kind of no big deal. It was a spur of the moment thing. They don't have much self-control. So look at a short prison sentence, bit of community service. That's all we need. But this person doing the mean social media posting, they threatened our power. They threatened our they threatened the very basis of our ideological control of the populace, and that we will not tolerate. So this is the difference that we're seeing here, and you see this in all ideological governments. Any imposed government by a minority is an ideological government. It's not government by consent. And so no one's consented to mass migration. No one's consented to having people from the third world running around murdering folks. And so no one's consented to any of that. And that's the nub of the issue. But then this is the idea of imposed power by a minority, in this case of globalist, globalist ideological fanatics and so on. So here's where we see the divergence between actual crimes and ideological crimes, and why ideological crimes are punished on a relative basis quite severely, whereas actual crimes, who cares? Now, an interesting sort of factor is that if you look at ideological governments, whether it's the Stasi in East Germany following World War II with an imposed communist government, you have the secret police with their informants and spies everywhere you look. The ratio of secret police in Nazi Germany, and certainly before, in the first, several years of Hitler's administration, the amount of secret police and so on was very few, astonishingly few, actually. And you look at all the communist regimes that were imposed, then they had spies and goons and thugs and informants and brutal interrogations where people were just beaten to death. And it was the same sort of thing. There wasn't really any concern about has the person committed a crime. It was about the ideology. Did they get a book out of the library by Shakespeare? Because that meant that they were bourgeois sympathetic, which meant they were counter-revolutionaries, which meant they were enemies of the people, which meant they had to be put in prison. So they had this sort of automatic escalation thing. Same as, well, if someone puts a social media posting questioning mass migration, it means they are hateful, racist bigots, therefore, and so they can automatically escalate. So when you infer intent, as in, you intended to do bad, you can then quickly escalate the intention up the intention ladder of being you disagree, which means you're opposed to, which means you hate, which means you're a Nazi, which means you're Hitler, and so they can automatically escalate that in the inference process without having to produce a shred of evidence anywhere. This is what the communists did. But surprisingly, in Nazi Germany, the government was not imposed. The government was with the consent of the people ultimately, and so So that the Nazis didn't need lots of secret police. They didn't need lots of insane propagandists constantly pumping. But they didn't do propaganda. They did, by the way. But if you look at the amount of propaganda, even in the Nazi party's own newspaper, it was quite tame compared to the Soviet communist newspaper in China and or in the Soviet Union or in Cambodia or wherever. So because there was largely the consent of the people, not if you were a Jewish gypsy communist, things wouldn't work out so good for you. But as for the the 99.5% of the people, they pretty much consented to the sort of government the Nazis has. The Nazis didn't need to have informants and spies and torture squads running around, whereas the Soviets and the Chinese and the ones they did have that, because it was not with the consent of the people. So we're looking in Britain at the moment where, given the consent for the government and the government's policies are so low, they have to resort to these terror tactics of arbitrarily arresting and imprisoning people that I would argue were innocent citizens. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.